Lynne Marsh's practice lies at the intersection of moving image, performance, and installation. She was born in Canada and studied fine art at the undergraduate level at Concordia University in Montreal and at the graduate level at Goldsmiths University in London, where she received her MFA. Presently, Lynne teaches studio practice in the BA and fine art programs at the University of Hertfordshire in the UK. Her work has been exhibited in solo exhibitions internationally at the Kunstlerhaus Benthanian in Berlin, at Steve Turner Contemporary in Los Angeles, at the Musée d'Art Contemporain de Montréal, at Daniel Arnaud Contemporary Art in London, and at Program in Berlin. She is also shown widely in group exhibitions and screenings, including, amongst many, the 10th International Istanbul Biennial, the Centre Culturel Montevermoso in Spain, Manif d'Art 5 in Quebec City, and the National Gallery of Canada. At present, Lynne divides her time equally between 3 cities: Montreal, where she exhibits frequently and is represented by Gallery Donald Brown, London, where she teaches, and Berlin, where she has her studio. So tonight, Lynne's going to be in conversation with Jennifer Hosek, an associate professor of German studies in languages, literatures, and cultures, who is also affiliated with film and media studies, cultural studies, and the University of Havana Queen's Exchange. Jennifer spent many periods in Berlin thanks to a series of fellowships and grants while a doctoral candidate at UC Berkeley in comparative literature, while a postdoctoral fellow at Stanford University, and as a faculty member here at Queen's. She is the author of Sun, Sex, and Socialism, Cuba in the German Imaginary, published by University of Toronto Press, 2012. Her current larger projects are linguelive.ca, an open access e-tandem platform that facilitates language exchange, as well as a monograph on transnational urban cinema. This evening, we're going to begin with a presentation by Lynne, which will include screening of clips of her work, Stadium and Planta Veld. This is going to be followed by a conversation between Lynne and Jennifer. Afterwards, we're going to have time for questions from the audience.
So, thanks again, Sarah, for the introduction, and thank you, Jennifer, for joining us tonight for the discussion. We seem to have a lot of crossovers in our interests in thinking about contemporary Berlin. I'll start with what brought me to Berlin, which was a year-long residency at Künstlerhaus Bethanien in 2006 and 2007. And this is a picture of actually the Künstlerhaus Bethanien, which was a former hospital, and I had the studio. I was like just on the other side of the tower on the second floor behind those trees, so I lived in this amazing building for a year. And since that time, I've been making a body of work that is very much in dialogue or informed by Berlin as a place. I came to Berlin at a time when it was already very established as an art world center, with artists moving there or living there part-time from all over the world. This creates a sense of Berlin as a studio or a place, a place for creative production with a lot of debate and dialogue and time for that, because the economic imperatives was and still is not nearly as high as other art centers. Berlin has still relatively cheap studio rents and very reasonable cost of living. It also means that many artists are using the city and its contexts for their work. Cultural and other kinds of institutions are open to cooperation with artists, and that includes musicians and dancers and curators. Berlin is a city charged, if not burdened, with history. It's very palpable. It's part of the atmosphere. And it's important for me to state that my take on Berlin is the viewpoint of a tourist and post-1989 reality. I'm observing and responding in my own way to sites and contexts that interest me. The point of view of a tourist also allows me a certain kind of freedom, an interpretation of sites and situations that are informed by their historical past. However, I'm interested in how they are operating socially and politically in the present tense as well. This evening I'm going to present two works, both location-based video works, one filmed at the Olympic Stadium, completed in 1936 during the Third Reich, and the second in a former East German amusement park, Planta Veld Kulturpark, which opened in 1969 and operated until 1989. In both video works, the sites can be understood not only as settings, but also as protagonists. The camera, and in particular the camera movement, attempts to describe attributes and animate characteristics, inciting a characterization of the space. This is inside the Olympic Stadium. So when I arrived in July 2006, Berlin was hosting the World Cup, so soccer championship, and the Olympic Stadium was on screens throughout the entire city. It had undergone a recent refurbishment by the architects Gerken, Marg and Partner. This is a picture of the stadium from Leni Riefenstahl's Olympia. And I'd already been interested in the stadium before arriving in Berlin through Riefenstahl's film. This is another image, kind of sketchy image, but those are all bodies on the field. My residency proposal was to look at how Olympia, documenting the 1936 Olympic Games in the same stadium, could be seen as a precursor to contemporary cinematic computer-generated imagery. I also wanted to think about the stadium in a contemporary context. I knew that the architects would have worked with a 3D model, and so I contacted them, and they provided me with this virtual model, which I could then reanimate in a 3D software. The architects kept true to the integrity of the original design, which is a monument of Nazi design, but added this amazing white roof that makes it look totally sci-fi. So this is my rendering of their model. I decided to create an animated sequence from the model as a way to free the stadium from its particular locality, to turn it into an object moving in space, and to enter it through the virtual or another future. So here I'll show two short clips. The first one, the opening sequence. Okay, the second sequence is a little further along in the work. So on location, we used this camera crane that allowed us to create movement similar to the 3D camera and to point to techniques favored by Riefenstahl, including the crane shot and long traveling, circling shots. The bird's eye view on the enormous seating blocks conveys a strong sense of the building's hierarchical structuring, which had been designed with the aim of organizing crowds. A figure in a white tracksuit enters the scene, underlining the standardized and absolute uniformity of the architecture and the anonymity of the individual within it. Then she slowly starts striding over the seats, going against the oppressive functionality of the architectural surroundings. Increasingly, her movements shift from pedestrian movement of public space towards a choreography reminiscent of early Olympic calisthenic designs and dances. The soundtrack for Stadium was composed by Stefan Neyman, an electronic musician from Vienna. Using his original music and recordings that we made on site, he describes an ominousness to the site and the tension between the figure and the architecture. The next work I'll show is Planta Veld, which was shot in the autumn of 2009 and completed in 2010. This piece is about 20 minutes, and here I'll show a clip of about 4 minutes. is an installation image from the National Gallery of Canada. And so the video is projected onto a large freestanding wooden screen that's reminiscent of a drive-in theater screen, slightly scaled down. And the viewer sits on these bleacher-like benches. So they're kind of low in the space, and the image is looming down towards the viewer. And the screen and the benches also point to this kind of outdoor architecture of the amusement park. Okay, a little backstory. I discovered the park, like many Berlin tourists, while on a bike ride along the Spree. It's an abandoned GDR, former East German amusement park, just along the east side of Treptow Park, not far from the Soviet monument, if you know that part of Berlin. And what you see from the bike path is a fenced-off forested area with some glimpses of very unusual architecture, swan boats, dinosaurs, and this iconic Ferris wheel. And on first sight, it feels like you've found this sort of lost land or some kind of contemporary ruin. The separation of these worlds is also very precarious, with a kind of flimsy fence, and of course what happens is a lot of people hop the fence and go explore. And in order to prevent people from trespassing into the park or catching people once they do, a security company has been hired to keep people out. I didn't hop the fence, although very tempted, but I immediately thought that I wanted to do some research and see if I could find the official channels or gain permission to get into the site. I did, however, go back a lot to see if I could catch glimpses of the guards, almost interested in monitoring them as they were sort of policing the park. The park opened in 1969 as Kulturpark Planta Veld and was a popular amusement park for East Berliners and East Germans through the 70s and 80s. After unification, the park was privatized. The lease was sold to Mr. Witte, and at the same time, Planta Veld, which is a kind of larger area than just the park, was declared a nature sanctuary. And from my understanding of the contract, the local municipality still owns and regulates the land. However, Mr. Witte owns the lease to the park. Under Mr. Witte, while the park was renamed Spree Park, and due to a complexity of issues, including land use restrictions, economic developments, and management issues, by 2001, the park was bankrupt and closed. Then a crazy story follows where Mr. Witte abandons the park, takes off to Peru with a few rides, telling the authorities that he's going to that he's having the rides fixed. He tries to open the park. The nuts and bolts are not the same sort of standard, so that fails. And then he ends up being caught smuggling drugs in the rides back to Germany. So, and there's a great documentary on him called Autobahn. So he goes to prison, and the park stands dormant for 7 years. So during that time, the city officials and creditors take charge of the park, hire a security company to safeguard the site. This is to protect them and the public from the collapsing architecture. In 2008, Mr. Witte was released from prison, the bankruptcy proceedings withdrawn, and the lease returned to him. What I found fascinating in the story and in my research into the current state of the park in 2009 was this sense of its preservation as a failed monument or failed project. After unification, the unstable and multi-layered identity of the German capital produced some failed market economy experiments, of which Spree Park or Planta Veld was one. The collision of two political systems in East and West Germany created a number of dead zones or no man's lands in the city, sites awaiting capitalization, some of which never succeeded. Planta Veld is still stuck in this moment and stands as a remnant to this collision. It embodies the status between these two political systems. The starting point for the work was the idea of the park's persistence to exist, and in a sense, to attempt to describe the being of the park as a kind of character. I was interested in the separation and cut-offness from public space and the futility of its policing. My successful entry into the park was through the security company. The company had not been paid for its services since the lease had been returned to Mr. Witte. They were, however, hanging in there in the hopes that new investors would be found, and a huge contract would come their way. So for a fee, I was able to gain access and found some guards who agreed to participate as actors. The question for me became how to perform the present condition of the park via the guards and via the camera. So these are images from Google Earth. I began looking at the topography of the park, its spatial design, and the way in which bodies are directed to navigate in a kind of constant, looping, circular way through the site. With my director of photography, we began to look for an apparatus that we could use to generate camera movement that would, in a sense, reinscribe this topography. And what we found was a pole cam, a lightweight pole with a tiny lens at the end that could be remotely controlled. The pole could swing in all directions, and the lens could pan up and down and turn 360 degrees to allow us to make these surreal camera movements. The filming then became a series of experiments in multi-camera perspectives and movements that would embody different subjectivities. These included tracking shots that create a series of hovering and suspended camera movements, traveling shots, so sometimes the camera is traveling parallel to the guards, or following the guards to the park as they kind of trace out this topography, and fixed shots or panning shots where there's a sense of observation, surveillance, or spying. The soundscape is made from recordings on site and was composed to immerse the viewer in the forest park and to create a sense of unease and suspense without any kind of reveal. And if you know Tarkovsky's Stalker, you'll see strong references to the cinematic language, which also describes a zone or otherworldly space. So in both Planta Veld and Stadium, I'm trying to speak to a sense of indeterminacy and open-endedness and unresolved using the suspended and hovering camera, as well as show a temporal progression, as well as a slow temporal progression in the montage to describe a moment before things happen or not, or potentially explode.
So I was actually struck by, well, so many things, but you were talking about, so you were talking about the way that the photography in the stadium was reminiscent of Riefenstahl and the kind of power. And then with the ruins of Planta Veld, there's so much green, and I was reminded of Benjamin's, Simmel. It's really more Simmel who talks about the way that nature overcomes the ruin, civilization. That there's the fight between civilization and nature, and I thought, wow, the stadium in such perfect condition, and Planta Veld sort of succumbing to the greenery. And I wondered if you wanted to talk about two things in regards to that. One, there are two very different histories, right? And the reclaiming of the histories are so different. On one hand, the fascist past, and then reuse that in some ways is very different and some ways is very similar, because sport, for example, has a kind of a there are some ways in which it reminds us of mass rallies and that sort of that emotion, right? So kind of frightening, but then on the other hand brings people together, brings society together. So it has those two sides, and then in this case, this kind of nothing happening kind of moment. So that whether you see, like, if you could talk about those differences,
Yeah.
and also what it was like to film in those places and to be there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was the thing that struck me the most, is what it was actually like to be in those spaces, because they're equally as intense, although, as you say, very different. What's amazing about the stadium is that I actually filmed it in color, and it really, it looks like a black and white film. It's totally gray, and there's no advertising, and there's no color in the seats. So, the only color is the pitch, but of course I don't show you the pitch. So details like Coke spills, and I don't know if you guys noticed the cigarette on the stairs, become like really important, really strong presence of humans.
It's like interrupting.
Yeah, interrupting that space. So it's a very powerful space. It's quite a scary space to be in. I've also been in that space to see football games, which is also exciting and scary. I'll try putting the mic closer. Is that okay? I was saying that in the stadium, I've been to see football games in the stadium, and Hertha Berlin has a very expressive fan club. And when they start pounding their feet and clapping in unison, it's quite terrifying. And of course, Planta Veld is the opposite. It's overwhelmingly full of details and rust and scratches on surfaces, but it was more of a magical place to be. You really felt like you were in both sense, you kind of feel like you're in a museum in some ways, but they also have a strong sense of presence. Like, Planta Veld is a place where kids break in and have parties, and more it's if you Google Spreepark, you'll see images all over the internet. It's becoming this kind of culty site, so it still has a kind of present reincarnation in a way. So both spaces were amazingly. I felt privileged to be in those spaces, actually. Yeah.
The comment that you make about the people breaking in and having parties reminds me of your comment at the beginning when you were talking about, you said Berlin as a studio, and I was thinking about how artists participate. We had talked about this actually. Artists participate in Berlin at this moment where it's still between the time, the open sort of openness geographically and in terms of just the sheer number of people that were there, and in terms of capital that was there with the fall, with the fall of the wall, and then what will be Berlin when it becomes the kind of metropole that exists in all of Western Europe, with basically not much space for people to interact if they don't have a lot of capital, basically. Mm-hmm. And it made me think about, so the term in German is Zwischennutzung, like it's the between, like a use between two different moments. At least for myself, I was sort of tricked into thinking when I first started going to Berlin regularly in the 90s, sort of thinking, oh, this place is great. It offers this kind of city where everybody can live and everybody can express themselves independent of who they are. Wow, it's just great. And only to find out that actually it was just Zwischennutzung and it's going away. And there's this kind of fight going on. And so, as you pointed out, Planta Veld is going to go away at some point. Well, maybe there'll be big Hochhäuser, big skyscrapers built there. I'm referencing my class because we were talking about the Frankfurt squatting movement. But my question is, where do artists participate in that?
Yes. Well, I'll come back to your question. I want to say that as one of the things that I've observed, I mean, in terms of this in-between space you're talking about, and it's really, that's been very exciting to see in Berlin, because there is a kind of, like a slow motion. It's like capitalization is just a little bit slower, and you see it happening. And I think because of the contested histories around a lot of these sites, there is a lot of hesitation. The Senate is kind of like Berlin municipality government level. They're very hesitant. The lobby groups are very strong, and there's a kind of cultural imperative, especially in Berlin. There was a lot of criticism when the wall came down sort of too quickly or disappeared too quickly. And so, there is this kind of, it's interesting because you can sort of see things better because it's slowed down. I think a lot of artists are interacting with that in a number of ways. I think there's people making work about that, so I'm definitely not the only one. And there's a lot of summer schools. Like right now, I was doing some research on Planta Veld, sort of like to find out, okay, what are the plans? There's still no development or new investors, but there's an artist group who have started having these summer schools there to rethink. They're trying to keep it as a kind of contemporary ruin and to look for ways to interact with it culturally. It's just set up sort of workshops in it, or and so there's exhibitions being held in former bunkers. There's not that many actually strong art institutions to show work. So what happens is a lot of these spaces end up being also taken over by artists or by curators or institutions like the Berlin Biannual, which will then house work in all these other sites. And so it's a kind of occupation. So it's becoming a physical site and a conceptual site, I think.
Do you think that there's, among artists, for example, political organizing that's happening in order to avoid having those kinds of sound very beautiful opportunities to being co-opted by investors, in the sense that when areas become hip, then one can command a higher price. So I don't know whether Mr. Witte is going to show up at some point once it's a very hip area in order to sell to somebody. I was thinking about.
There's so much resistance to that. It's unbelievable.
Yes.
Like on my street on Reichenberger Straße, they made which is West Kreuzberg, so it's kind of it's always been a very leftist neighborhood, and it has really strong community groups. So they built a luxury condo where you could drive your car in, and then it would like go up an elevator and stuff. And there's a cafe beside it. And they have to post a security guard in front of this building 24 hours because people have vandalized, have written all over this building, have spit on people in the cafes. I mean, it's really, really, it's more radical than anywhere else I've seen in Europe in terms of this anti or against this gentrification. I don't know how long that can resist, but it's certainly there in a strong way. I think, I don't know, maybe I want to be optimistic. They turned the Tempelhof airfield into one of the biggest parks I've ever seen, and you can literally ride your bike or rollerblade down this runway, you know. I'm hoping that there's still a resistance. I'm hoping that there's still a resistance.
Mm-hmm. I wonder whether there are different, this is a bit of a topic shift, but whether you've noticed any differences in the reception of your work among people who are more from the East, you know, or more from the West trained. And then also it would interest me whether British audiences are, see that your work differently than, say, German audiences.
Yeah. Well, I think German audiences would definitely see the work differently, but when I showed, in 2008, I showed a stadium in Los Angeles, and people read it as read it sort of through the context of New Orleans, and that, you know, people were housed in stadiums, you know, so I think depends on how much, you know, people read a text before they see a work. They're going to make whatever connections that they can to places that they know. Mm-hmm. So I think that the work reads more directly in terms of its specific references to a German audience or audience who are, you know, familiar with these places, but I hope it speaks to broader audiences. East and West. It's hard to say. I don't know. I'm trying to think of who. When I was at Battanian, one of the technicians and sort of friend of mine was an East German, and yeah, probably, but I haven't. I'd have to do more of a survey to find out. I couldn't say exactly.
Mm-hmm. I'm concerned a little bit about time for the audience, but I guess that what I was thinking about was also something that we had talked about in preparation for this talk, which was the question of which histories of Berlin remain present in the city after the changes, and which ones go into decay, and which ones are reconstructed, let's say. And we're talking about the Palast der Republik, for example, which was an East German building that was demolished. And that was what I wondered, I guess, more specifically, whether there might be East Germans who, you know, were kids going to Planta Veld, and how they would feel about seeing a film like this, when it seems like their history is so frequently being erased.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's really true. So the Palace of the People, or the Palast der Republik, was a site that's right in this, near Alexanderplatz, right in the center of Berlin. And when I arrived in Berlin in 2006, it was also a kind of a huge event in the media, because they were deciding to tear this down. And so for me, the difference between the Planta Veld and that site was very significant, in that Planta Veld was a kind of monument to failure that was in some way allowed to remain. But this kind of very successful symbol of socialism that was in the middle of the city had to be torn down. And there was a lot of a lot of resistance to that, and artists were actually using that space for exhibitions before it was torn down. Mm-hmm. So I would say that would be you know, a fair assessment. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What questions do we have from our audience?
Lynn, I was wondering if you could speak a bit about the sound in stadium. You talked a bit about collaborating with an electronic musician, and I think obviously the sound is a key component of the affect of that piece. So could you just speak a bit about your collaboration there?
Yeah, I wanted stadium to have music more. Well, a kind of combination of music and a bit of ambience or sound recorded on site. Because I was trying to make this link between the kind of digital and old analog, I wanted the soundtrack to feel electronic and contemporary, and so I actually went. I have a friend who's the director of one of the music festivals in Berlin, and so I was showing him some material, and I asked him, you know, do you know some people that I could work with? and he suggested a couple of people, and I looked them up and looked at what they were doing already. And Stefan Neyman was really someone, some of the sounds he was making and how he was working with sound was something I was interested in. So, and he was making frequent trips to Berlin. So we sat down together, and my direction, I guess, a little bit was I wanted, the opening sequence, I really wanted to reference like Space Odyssey, kind of 2001, so I wanted strings. I wanted to have those strings. I also talked a lot about Hitchcock and that kind of tension and that sort of pitch that Hitchcock has, so to create that sort of suspense and tension. We used just the ambient recording of the whatever air systems that were there, the flip-up seats, so that sort of, it sounds like it's her footstep, but it's around her footstep, but it's not her footstep. It's just the seats flipping up. So it's really his composition, but my notes. Yeah.
Lynne, I'm wondering how you negotiate your time between Montreal, Berlin, and London. How does that look on a yearly basis?
Well, I'm teaching part-time in London, but I teach on a studio practice program that it's not the same as here. We don't have courses in the same way, so I can bunch up days. So I have intensive days with my students, and then I have time off. So I might be back and forth every 10 days or every 2 weeks or so. Depending, Montreal often is, I'm there for projects. I also do a lot of my post-production in Montreal. I have an editor that I work with that I really love working with. And there's good, I don't know if you know about Prim, it's a kind of artist-run center where you can do offline or online, and it has a sound studio. So I go and work there often too, and I work with a gallery there, and I have friends there. So it changes all the time. I'm maybe 3 times a year in Canada and back and forth between the other two.
Do you find it exhausting, or do you find it that it works to make your work more vibrant?
Yeah, I don't know how long I will. It could all change again. I don't know. I find that when I get, I take these cheap flights between London and Berlin, and when I get on EasyJet, I feel like I'm going into the studio. I kind of can. It helps me separate the kind of work that I have to do, and I try. Otherwise, I think anybody knows who's teaching. It's like can be all-consuming, never-ending. Your email, So it's nice to have these kind of really performative psychological barriers in a way. It's very expensive to keep a studio in London. It's very, Montreal has amazing post-production facilities, and my practice is really kind of based and comes out of there. I'm still, funded by Calc, and so I'm still a resident there. It's home. I'm not going to be a British artist or a German artist. I'm a Canadian artist. I'm a Quebec artist. So, so I need to keep that. It's a temporal thing now. I don't know, it could all change.
I was just wondering about the figure in Stadium. Was there a specific reason why you chose the figure to be a female rather than a male?
Yeah. Honestly, it's because I used to be a performer in my own work, and Stadium is the first work where I used another performer. And I tried to look for someone that could maybe look like me, but she doesn't really look like me. Her face is, but just her body. But not that I really wanted the person to be me, but I think I was looking. I think I understood how a female body could perform because I was doing a lot of performance in my own work, and so that was easier for me to think about working with a woman. I also wanted to work with a dancer. She's a dancer because I could never, like the strength that it took to walk over those seats was pretty incredible. I mean, she's doing it like it's nothing, but it's actually quite intense.
I was there last night, and then looking at your work today, there's something about the clarity and the strength of the images and the focus. Like there's a place in the second images where there's grass. It's all sort of derelict, and there's these blades of grass that just are outstanding. And is that always your style, to be so crisp is the word I can think of, but I apologize because I really don't know what the words are to use, but there's something about how you look at things that's very clean?
Oh, okay. Well, I think Stadium's very formal in its framing, and probably the cleanest in that sense. Planta Veld, yeah, I guess there are these sort of pictorial or beautiful shots, but there's also the wide angle on the little pole cam lens, which does a kind of distortion. And last night I think it kind of varies. Last night in the Bruckner piece, the two bottom screens are hardly ever in focus. I mean, they're kind of wandering around, and the top ones are fixed and still, so they're clean and crisp. But the heads are also moving out of frame. So I don't know. I don't think it's so uniform necessarily, but maybe I have an instinctual. I'm looking for some kind of balance in the frame. Yeah.
Maybe it's more about the power of the images than the crispness that I'm trying to get at. But there's something very powerful in some of the ways things look. So maybe you could talk about power in the context of your work.
Okay. Well, I think there's different ways in the power of the image, or the power, because I think there's different ways I'm playing with power and hierarchies in the sites. Like in some ways there's maybe in Planta Veld the guards are disempowered in some way, because they're sort of standing around, bored, walking around, not doing very much. I don't know that the images for me feel like they're about power, but there is a sort of diffusion of authority in a way, or a kind of a pointlessness to it. Maybe in the Bruckner piece and the Philharmonie piece, there's a sort of switch in the hierarchical system. So instead of you seeing what you would normally see, like the musicians on the stage, you're seeing this. You're seeing the kind of technical team in the background as the main event. And so maybe, in a sense, I'm photographing them in a way that elevates their status. There's one of the things maybe that it comes across, and maybe this is something, I don't know if this is maybe something that you're referring to, is that there's very often a limited frame, a limited view. So you don't really ever get, even in Planta Veld, you don't really get, maybe that's something that's more signature, is that I'm very tight in the frame. You don't have in Planta Veld there's one shot, you didn't see it, there's one shot where you see something, you see a bit more of an open plane, but normally the view is more narrow, is tighter, and that kind of creates a sort of abstraction in a way, so you don't ever get the whole picture. Yeah. I don't know if that answers your question, sort of.
I'm not sure it's a question that really has an answer. I guess I have a feeling of a sense of purpose, that you have a sense of purpose, that you really communicate to me as a watcher.
Well, that's good.
Maybe that's how I
Well, I think I tried to talk about that, and maybe didn't come out super clear, but I do have particular ideas in terms of how I'm framing a site and what I'm trying to maybe get across through that framing. So I talk about the sort of hovering and suspension of the camera as also being connected to this maybe sense of indeterminacy or unresolved about the nature of those spaces. So those are maybe some of the things that I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about how the camera moves or how to frame it.
In the back?
Lynn, I don't know anything about what really is going on here tonight except what I have read through the Agnes literature that's come out to us as members. And what I thought I got from the preamble was that it's a tourist view of Berlin. And I'm here as a tourist.
Yes.
And an ancient. So probably what the students are seeing there is totally different from what I'm seeing. Because when you put that stadium on, all I saw was the Third Reich and soldiers marching without thinking, straight ahead, no emotion, no nothing. And your white person was some person still wanting to break that pattern and going to any method they could think of, despite all that regimentation.
And that's a great reading.
I found it totally disturbing.
Mm-hmm.
It was beautiful artwork, but it just took me back to that period.
Sure, yeah.
Now, I don't know if that's what you thought you were doing, but that's what it did to me.
Yeah.
And then you went to the park. Well, I think if you were in Berlin as a tourist, I think German persons are still trying to figure out who they are.
Absolutely.
Because you're still east and west, whether you're plopped in as one now. And when you look at, there's still that decay with everything falling down from before, but the persistent growth and beauty, which was beyond imagination. And they don't know what to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
They're still living in the past, present, and potential future. But then you went and ruined it all only because you put those guards in there, so that didn't let me, in a way, it took away my hope.
Right.
Because the old stuff was falling down, and all this beauty was coming up, but still there are guards marching, like in wartime, everywhere, watching.
Yeah.
So, I don't know if you realize the power of what you've done, but if you would show that to people of different age generations, I think you would get a totally different response from each, depending on where you find yourself. So I hope I haven't gone off.
Your observations are amazing and they're right on. I looked at Lenny Riefenstahl, I looked at Triumph of the Will, I looked at films that showed, marching soldiers, and I knew, the minute you go to that stadium, that's what you see. That's what everybody sees. And when I use the word tourist, it's because that's what I see when I go to the stadium. I use the word tourist because I don't own that history in the sense that I'm not from there. I didn't grow up there. I didn't, So I'm coming in as an outsider and making these observations. But what you're saying is absolutely true and absolutely part of the content of the work. Just the comment on the guards. Yes, they ruin it, but but they're there. They're part of the space. So it for me that was also kind of interesting because the guards are now diffused. So in the way that that there's a presence of the guards in the stadium through the seating, which really replicates those rows and rows of soldiers, or even replicates the Jewish monument, if you've seen the Jewish monument in Berlin, which is these sort of stacks of gray marble, I guess. So the guards aren't in, they have no order, they have, their power has been kind of, diffused. So that was my choice and also because they sort of are part of that space, that was my choice to keep them in.
It didn't mean it ruined your work.
No, you can say it ruined the work. Maybe you're right. Thank you for your comments, yes.